Welcome back. You are doing less once more with John and Jeff. We're back at it. We took a little break of a week. We had some issues last week recording, but well, we're back, and thank you for listening to us.
We had a chronic case of doing less.
My internet speed was doing less. Couldn't facilitate
Yeah, from what I've heard, though, a lot of you guys are out there. You're spreading the word of doing less. You know, you'll say, oh, you know, someone will come up to you and be like, oh man, I can't hang out. I'm swamped with all this stuff. And then you'll be like, do less. And that's good, but you got to get them to listen. We need to turn this into a cult, okay? We need the whole world to be doing less. It can't just be us doing less.
Yes, that would be good.
But that would be doing too much, so just keep doing what you're doing.
On a bit of a somber note, something that we did want to mention that did happen last week was Paul Volcker, who was the chair of the Federal Reserve in the late 70s and 80s, passed away, and he was regarded as, some regard him as the last great Fed chairman, last one who remained not influenced by political pressure. After him, you got Greenspan, Bernanke, Yellen, and now Powell, who cannot. The same could not be said about them, but we just wanted to mention him, his passing. Rest in peace.
Yeah, under Paul Volcker, we had interest rates of 20%. So that, not to say that like that's the right interest rate. You know, maybe that was too high, but he kind of did what he felt was necessary to fight inflation at the time, which was really, really high. And it was pretty unpopular to raise the interest rates that high. But he did it anyway because he felt it would be in the interest of the long-term economy. But at the end of the day, we don't really want to have to rely on people to make the right choices, right? Like, we shouldn't have this institution where it takes the right man for the job or the right woman for the job to set interest rates according to the good of all of us. Like, that's we're asking too much.
Yeah, exactly.
Really, this power just shouldn't exist in the first place.
Right. Yeah, to say that one man was, adequate, who did a good job, is to say that another man could do a bad job. And when you're talking about the global economy, you don't even want to introduce that possibility, and especially when it gets mired with political intermingling, you can really find some really bad incentives, which we see with the latter Fed chairman. So, which brings us to our next point, which we wanted to mention about last week, which was the December FOMC meeting, the December Federal Open Market Committee meeting within the Federal Reserve. They held that meeting to discuss their rate policy, which was largely understood that they would not do anything, not cut rates or hike rates.
Yes, doing less.
That was the case. They did not. They did less. They didn't do anything.
Our podcast is working.
Yeah, right. So the press conference was pretty much forgettable. I would say I watched it, and there wasn't a lot said. Powell came out and basically said all the same things that he said in previous, FOMC meetings, rate policy meetings. But the one thing I will say is changing is this whole thing that we mentioned with the repo market. Demand for repo market has caused yields to spike within the repo market, and he has mentioned that. Jerome Powell has mentioned that in the past, saying, it's just a technical issue that they're handling. This time he actually came out and said something along the lines of, you know, we're we're seeing potential issues with like year-end liquidity requirements in banks that could cause some concern, but he never said anything along the lines of like drastic measures or like quantitative easing or something to some kind of response. But what he says is not exactly what he does, right, Jeff?
Yeah. So, for if you don't know what a repo is, it's not the same thing as when your car gets repoed. That's something different. Well, it's kind of similar.
That's an important distinction.
Yeah. So repo, it's it's short for repurchase agreement. That's not really important. At the end of the day, what it is a repo is when banks lend money to each other in the short term. But banks don't always want to just lend massive amounts of cash without collateral. And what collateral is it's some sort of asset that can be claimed in case the loan isn't paid back, right? Because these short-term loans are pretty risky. And so banks like to have collateral with them. So if you were to get a mortgage, your house would be the collateral. Like if you stopped paying your mortgage, the bank would get your house. And that's one of the reasons why mortgages are actually, the rates are pretty low. Like if a bank was just lending you, $300,000 just cash, you could never get a 5% rate on that. You'd be living in Candyland. So it's the fact that the bank can claim the house if you don't pay the loan that makes the rates so low. And so these repurchase agreements, they're loans from one bank to another, or not always banks actually. It's a lot of times not banks. They're loans from one party to another, in which one party buys a bunch of securities, usually treasuries, like U.S. treasuries, and then they buy them back from the person at a higher rate, right? So you sell all your treasuries up front for a bunch of cash, and then the person has an incentive to do that because they know you're going to buy it back at an agreed upon higher price. So this is like essentially a short-term loan in which, let's say I sell all my treasuries and get that cash, but then I don't have the cash to buy them back. At least the bank still has all my treasuries. So it's a low risk loan, and that's why generally the rates are pretty low. But what actually happened in September was the rates went up to 10%. And the reason for that is not 100% known, but essentially at the end of the day, all that matters is the number of people who wanted to lend money versus the number of people who had money to lend, or the number of people who wanted to borrow money exceeded the number of people who had money to lend. And so that drove the price up of lending up to 10%. And this is at odds with what the Fed mandates the interest rate be. They say overnight lending ought to be 1.75% at the federal funds rate. So if the market is exceeding that, then they're sort of breaking what the Fed sees fit in terms of interest level. And so this to the Fed is a problem. And so they have taken the onus to step in and print money to buy securities like treasuries so that there's excess reserves in the system so that the supply goes back up and then that rate comes back down to where they want it to be. That's essentially what's going on.
Right. So the Federal Reserve printing money is not new, right? That's happened since the existence of the Fed. Repo operations are normal, all this stuff. When the repo market spikes, that's not normal, right? That means something's going on that the Federal Reserve needed to address. Jerome Powell, in his meetings, in his FOMC meetings where he makes his statement, has pretty much to date just referred to that as a technical glitch, like a technical error. Nothing systemic, nothing like actual to worry about. Just like, we just need to provide liquidity, short-term liquidity. It's not a big deal. Well, what Jeff just said, they've begun printing money to add to their balance sheet, to add treasuries to their balance sheet and absorb, government debt. That is actually also not a new thing. That's called quantitative easing. That was for the first time a massive purchasing of government debt while printing money by the Federal Reserve began after the 2008 crisis. Right, the Federal Reserve deemed that it was necessary to address the unhealthiness of that economy to try to prop it back up with money printing. They called it quantitative easing. And they did 3 rounds of that over the next 6 years. So they printed money and absorbed treasuries from banks onto their balance sheets so that the banks would have liquidity to operate and continue to continue the economy to function and remain healthy.
Right. And so the reason they did that is because normally the only lever that the Fed moves in history was interest rate. They would just move this federal funds rate up or down. That was like their control button on the economy. So they move this thing up or down, and usually that was enough to achieve the goals that they wanted to achieve. We're not going to get into right now if those goals are even worthwhile pursuits, but essentially at the end of the day is they're trying to achieve some result by changing the interest rate. And in 2008, it was such a big crisis that even though they dropped the interest rate all the way down to 0, banks were still going bankrupt. The stock market was collapsing. It looked like we were in major trouble. And so the Fed deemed this such a worthy crisis that they needed to not only lower interest rates, but also flush banks with excess reserves so that lending could continue and all these other things that happen in a normal, healthy economy could keep going on. And so these were really extreme measures to take. And so this has not happened at all throughout the course of the United States until 2008. So that was like a really significant point in history. And then now the Fed is literally doing exactly what they did in the depths of one of the worst financial crises in history right now, when things are supposedly very good.
Exactly. So what happened in 2008 was essentially unprecedented.
Mm-hmm.
People thought this could never work. You can't just print money and absorb treasuries and also mortgage-backed securities, which at the time were considered toxic sludge by investors. So it's like, we can just print money and everything's okay. Well, as long as you can resell what you bought at a later date, which we've talked about in a previous podcast, is what we tried to do last year, ending in December, because the stock market started to crash. Mm-hmm. So as they tried to unwind what they did in 2008 onward, there was massive negative reactions to it. And what are we doing? Where do we find ourselves 1 year later from that attempt? The exact opposite. Exactly what we did in the first case. What we tried to unwind and couldn't, now we are redoing and then some. But the difference this time is it's not officially quantitative easing. And that's the point I was trying to get to. Jerome Powell, in his statement, never at any point mentioned, those emergency measures we took during the depths of, a financial crisis, we're doing the same thing. He hasn't said that. In fact, he said the opposite. He said, you think this is quantitative easing? This is not quantitative easing. He has come out and said this is not quantitative easing when it is the same. It's the same fundamentals. There are slight differences at this time, but it's like arbitrary. It's like not even worth discussing. It's
Right.
short-term treasuries instead of long-term treasuries, which the short-term treasuries can just get rolled over, you know, to have a long-term
Right.
event. But his unwillingness to even admit that this is the same thing as what happened in the past is very disturbing to me.
Right.
It's not maintaining open communication. I don't think he's telling us everything that's actually going on. I think he's, creating a PR stunt, which we know that's what the Federal Reserve does. They want to maintain happy relations. They want to maintain, a happy public.
Right. It seems like they think if they scare the public, they're going to like scare us into recession. And the idea that your economy can only function on good psychology, is that a world you really want to live in? Where the only way things can operate healthily and normally is if everyone is just like, things are great, things are great. Like, that's not a normal situation. Like, if you're, let's look at a business, right? Like, something like Exxon, right? They drill oil, and they're involved in basically all the process of getting oil out of the ground and then getting it into your car. I don't care how scared you are or how bad you think things are, you're still putting gas in your car to make it go. Like, that business does not rely on your psychology very heavily. In fact, gas is pretty inelastic in terms of like things like that. And so if your entire economy is just like, it needs to perpetuate this psychological condition that things are fine or else the whole thing will collapse to the ground, like, is that really a good thing? Do we want to be living in that world? Or is like, maybe we need to take a step back and be like, okay, maybe we want to live in a world where it's okay if people get scared, the world can continue to operate no matter if people are scared or not. Like, this is a very suspect thing to believe.
What the Fed's goal, what they're trying to do, it reminds me of if I was to take a girl on a date, right? And say I work really hard, I have a good car, I show her my house, it's a really, I just worked really hard, nice house, right? And we're going on dates and it's working out, it's going really well. And on the third date, I decide to, try to try to make her laugh. I tell her a joke, and the joke doesn't really land. I try to salvage it, but she's just like, didn't really do it for me. Well, what is that relationship built on? She, we had a lot of trust going into it. She likes the way I live my life. She respects me, and what's going to happen at the end of that date? I probably have a pretty good chance of maintaining the relationship. She's probably not going to hold that one over for too long. She might just say, okay, that was a pretty bad joke, but I don't really care. Like, do better next time. Try to impress me better next time. But now let's imagine instead of that life I was living, I was in debt. I'm not responsible. I don't really have anything going for me, but I want to impress her. So on the first day, I show up in a leased car that I can't afford. I show her, I get a hotel room for the night or something, and I really try to impress her with like an expensive, exorbitant date, right? Well, how long is that going to last? Maybe I'll make it to the third date before my credit cards get cut up. My lines of credit are all used up, right? On that third date, she sees I had been renting clothes even that I was gonna return the clothes I'm wearing the next day. And she sees the tag still on my clothes. She's just like, like, this guy's a loser. And I like say like, but wait, I have a joke. Let me tell you a joke. And I try to convince her that I'm funny at least. It doesn't even matter if I say the best joke in the world. She's probably still gonna leave me. It's probably not gonna work out. I've been maintaining this facade, this front for her. I'm trying to make it work on my superficial looks, mm-hmm. and just the not real stuff. Well, it doesn't matter what I say in that date. If she's catching on to my real life, mm-hmm. she's probably gonna not care about in that scenario. She's not going to care even if I say the funniest joke in the world. Maybe she'll go on one more date with me before she's like, I really can't stand this anymore. Like, he said a good joke last time, but he's living an unsustainable life. In that first scenario, it doesn't really matter what you say superficially. Like, the merit is in the actual lifestyle. Like, if you're leading a responsible life and you've got that foundation, right, you can afford to be a little bit careless with the stuff that doesn't matter. Whereas if the stuff that doesn't matter is all you focus on, you could probably fool her for a little bit, but then it's gonna come crashing down. And it doesn't matter if you think that it's because you didn't explain something or you didn't say the joke right. She's gonna be like, I don't care about that. I care about the fact that you're a loser.
Yeah, and so like the idea that our economy, right? So most of our economy, I hear this all the time with people, this misconception that they throw around where they're like, oh, isn't spending good for the economy? That's good, right? Well, if the spending is built on debt and that debt is funded by printing money, that's unsustainable. It can't last forever. So you're like the guy who's just putting the appearance of being wealthy just to get the girl. Like, you're not going to be able to keep that up forever. And so if that whole thing is built on psychology, this facade, it's so fragile. That's not the place you want to be in. You want to be in a place where it's built on trust and honesty, and like you had an economy that's built on, you don't constantly need people to be burning a hole in their pocket with their money, like just buying everything they see left and right. Like, your economy should be able to work just fine, like have a healthy level of employment, whether or not people are in a mood to spend a lot or in a mood to save more or whatever. It should be able to withstand those flows of psychology one way or the other. And if you find yourself in this setting where it's like, we cannot risk a lapse of confidence, we're just like that guy. We can't risk a lapse in her judging us as something we're not, because the whole thing will come crashing down. Like, that is a very precarious position to be put in. And so you can see this getting worse and worse. 2008, we're taking unprecedented measures of printing money. And they said, this is temporary. We're never going to do it again. This is a one-time thing. We're going to unwind it. That's what they said. And so if you look at a graph of their balance sheet, well, okay, in 2008, they start the printing presses. It gets up to $4.5 trillion. Okay. It stays that way for 10 years. Now we're in 2018. They're like, okay, it's time. We're at full employment, basically. Everything's looking good. Everything's fine. We can finally start to unwind this thing. Okay. They do this for about 6 months. They get it down to like 3.8 trillion. So they cut it by like around $0.5 trillion. And then everything hits the fan. And so
stock market starts to crash.
Yeah.
It goes down 13% in 9 days last December.
Yeah. And so they're like, all right, hold on. Now the repo market's exploding. They're like, okay, we got to step in. But there's like, no, it's just it's a technical glitch. It's like, no, I swear I'm rich. No, that's totally my car. It's like, you got to believe me. You got to believe me. Like, everything's fine.
Yeah,
I swear,
exactly.
Everything's great. And it's like, but now here they are printing money at a rate almost equivalent. Well, before this recent announcement, it was almost as much as quantitative easing in 2008. But now with that additional $4 trillion that they just announced, or $400 billion that they just announced, that's going to bring us right back up to where we were before we started unwinding. Like, we lasted 6 months of tightening. That's it. That's all we lasted. And everything went haywire. Like, stuff just started springing leaks without that excess cash. So that cash, it was printed, but it's here to stay. It's never going away. That was a fantasy. And so at the end of the day, hopefully we don't have to keep printing more. But, that's kind of that might be a little optimistic. We might be stuck in this system in which the only way to keep it going is to keep printing more and more money. And, the downsides to that are pretty huge. If you just keep printing money over and over and over again, you're going to destroy your currency. And that's the foundation of an economy. If you don't have a functioning currency, you have nothing. And there's tons of examples all throughout history of that. So
yeah, so one of the reasons I wanted to start this podcast and what I wanted to kind of convey, if we go back to that analogy of the guy and his girlfriend, is that all of the citizens of the U.S., we are the girlfriend, and the government and the Federal Reserve is the boyfriend. And if the boyfriend does this thing in 2008 where, it's like super unprecedented, kind of crazy, not in a good way, like irresponsible, and you say to yourself, is this really sustainable? Like, should we really believe that this is like our future, like this is the best future for us?
Mm-hmm.
Right? We, as the girlfriend, when it comes to like a time like this, like, hearing what the Federal Reserve came out and said, what Jerome Powell came out and said last week, it's not a big deal. It's just, this is just addressing like a technical issue. We're still trying to understand what, it's not an actual problem that needs to be addressed. It's just something we're like researching and trying to understand what went wrong, like just downplaying it, saying it's not a big deal. We have to be the girlfriend that says enough is enough. Stop telling me this.
Yeah,
right?
It's almost like we're being gaslit.
Yeah.
Where it's like, they're like, you're just being, oh, you don't know the term? So gaslighting someone is like when you basically deny all their thoughts and feelings and reasons as them just being crazy. Like, oh, you're nuts. You're being crazy. And so it's like, they're just like, they're like, yeah, everything's fine. And if you act like, okay, wait, no, hold on. I have a few concerns. They're like, no, everything's fine. Everything's fine. And it's just like, they act like you're out of your mind if this stuff seems fishy, or like, you just think maybe we shouldn't be trusting them to do all this. Like, I don't know. It's just no one ever really talks about this. And like John said, that's kind of why we want to start a podcast, is to just start the conversation, because there's a good chance this starts to get really ugly for us. And the last thing we want is people finding scapegoats in the wrong places. Like, hopefully if we have a record of like all the things going wrong here, then people can say, okay, there's some credibility here, like X, Y, and Z. We saw the problems then, they continued, they got worse, and then here we are. Versus people just being blindsided over the head, then getting up. It's like if you're at a bar and you get punched in the back of the head, and you fall down, and you're like, you just get up and you just hit the first person you see, because you're just like, who hit me? And then you just punch the first guy you see. It's like, I feel like that's exactly what's going to happen. We're going to get blindsided over the head, because most people aren't looking at what's coming. They don't see it coming. And so they're going to just assign blame to the first like culprit they can find. And it's not going to help solve the problem. Like, we need to take a step back and see where that punch came from, so that we can correctly turn and punch that guy in the face.
Yeah. I mean, you already see it. You already see what, like, people are so happy to say, like, oh, the stock market is up. The stock market's up, 20% this year, or more, hitting all-time highs. But then that same person's like, oh, wealth inequality in this country is running rampant, right? So you're cheering for, you might have $100,000 in stocks. You have your whole 401k or whatever. You have some amount of money, which is 100,000 is not a meager amount by any means, but you know, someone who's like well on their way through their career, saving up for retirement, $100,000 in stocks. It's like, yeah, 20%. That's congratulations. That's 20,000 extra dollars that you wouldn't have had. So you're right to be happy. That's that's definitely something to cheer on. But you know who has 10 million in stocks? The 1%.
Right.
Everyone in the 1% has so much more to gain from stocks going up. So to just cheer that stocks are going up while also condemning the 1% getting ultra wealthy, well, you're just you're not properly assessing the blame. Like if you're blaming the 1% for that, well, they're just as happy as you that their money is gaining value, right? For the same reason that you're happy. Like, why are you mad at them for what you're happy about?
Right. Yeah, and it's really amazing how much they're not talking about. $425 billion in 1 month. Like, this amount of money is half of the federal deficit, right? So they're not directly paying for the deficit with this money. But if you've ever seen Rick and Morty, there's this one episode where Rick builds this battery. He like builds a little universe. This show's like a sci-fi show. And he builds this little universe in that, and he has the people like run on a treadmill, and he siphons like a little of their power to run his car. And his friend is like, that just sounds like slavery with extra steps. And if you look at what the Fed's doing right now, it's like, no, they're not directly funding the deficit, but what are they buying? They're buying treasuries, okay? That's the U.S. Government's method of issuing debt. And so if they keep buying treasuries with all this money they're printing, they're making it easier for the government to spend money because they can do it at a lower rate. So it's like they're not directly printing money to pay off the spending, but it's like they're just adding extra steps. So it's like,
yeah, it's what they're doing. It's just like once or twice removed.
Right.
Being directly.
And that may not be the goal of what they're doing, but at the end of the day, that's what they're enabling. And so if they're printing $400 billion of money to buy treasuries, they're going to keep enabling these ballooning deficits that are going to basically bankrupt us. And so this may not be the intention of what they're doing, but it's the effect. And like, who really cares what their intention is if the effect is going to ruin us?
Yeah, we've spoken in a previous episode about why the federal debt is such a problem. That debt grows each year uninhibited because of actions of the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is, okay, it's not directly writing blank checks that the federal treasury is cashing in, but they're essentially doing that, right? If almost half of the deficit that's expended in 1 year by the federal treasury is simultaneously printed by the Federal Reserve, you got to start asking, like,
it's if you have like a hose and you're pouring in to a bucket and the bucket's leaking at the same rate the hose is, like, you know,
someone says, here's another hose, or here, tap into my water supply, right? Keep filling up that bucket. Whereas a sane person would go, patch the leak. Why don't you patch the leak? That's your problem.
Right.
You wouldn't have to tap into any more excess water. You don't have to create more water source. You just patch the leak and you're fine.
Right.
But for the government, it's easier to just to double down and just get more water and have the leak expand to be twice as big.
Right. I mean, the analogy kind of ends there, but the reality is that when your hose is more money, it's not good for us because it basically eats away at our savings. If you have high inflation, that's like devastating to an economy. If you can't, especially if you have high and unpredictable inflation. Because then it's impossible to plan anything. If you accept a job and you have no idea, like they'll put a number on a piece of paper, but you don't know what that's going to get you. It's very hard to have contracts and deals and agreements and all these things that make the economy run. If you have no idea what that number that people are writing down is going to translate to a year from now.
Right. Yeah, most people that live in our country today, that are U.S., grew up in the U.S., they're familiar with, they've had price stability for their whole lives, essentially, to a degree, right? So their payment in dollars has stayed relatively stable over time. So that purchasing power that Jeff was talking about can kind of be maintained. So that $10 this year gets you about what it gets you next year, right? There's certain examples of when that's not necessarily the case, but it's not like it was unimaginable. Like price stability got so bad it was like, in some countries where you wake up and one denomination of their currency becomes 1/100th of what it used to be.
Right.
So no one in our country for a long time has had to, or really ever has had to deal with that. Some people lend that credit to the Federal Reserve. It's like, oh, thank goodness we have a Federal Reserve because they're maintaining price stability. I would lend more credit to just, we just had a good economy. We through freedom and through good government for a lot of it. Well,
I'd say good government, meaning the government stayed out of the way for a lot of things.
Yeah, did less. That allowed the economy to become healthy, and then the dollar that's denominated through the entity that's taxing that economy, right? So kind of deriving its value from the healthiness of that economy, remains stable. I would actually lend the blame on the Federal Reserve for all of the inflation that has occurred. 96% of the dollar 100 years ago is now worth, well, how should I say, $1 100 years ago is now 96% less valuable than it is. So that's not even really price stability. That's
right. Yeah, it's weird, right? So like, what we've asked of the Fed is to maintain price stability, but we've never even really defined what that means. And so they've just sort of, in recent history, chosen 2% inflation is price stability. But for all you people who aren't math magicians out there, if you have 2% growth year after year, that's exponential growth, right? That's like not linear growth. Would be like a line, like it's just a steady increase in something. That's what I would deem as, you could call that stable, right? Or just a straight flat line that never goes up, that's stable. But I think as long as it's linear, that's pretty stable. But 2% increase in price every year is not linear, it's exponential. That's exponential growth in the prices. So it's weird that we define that as stability. That just doesn't really make sense to me.
Yeah. And the Federal Reserve, they really take it to heart. This 2% target, which we can talk about, was not really the case. Like what Jeff was just saying, that's not really stability. Well, around 1973, I think they took that upon themselves to say 2% per year is stable. And therefore, and then just this year, or like right around the end of last year, they decided that a symmetric 2% inflation target is what stable means. So if any year inflation runs below 2%, the next year it should run above 2%. And they've really taken this to heart, as can be witnessed in the latest Federal Reserve kind of press conference. He must have said 100 times, right, we're seeking this inflation target. We need more inflation. More inflation is good for the economy. We need to increase inflation expectation. We need to have symmetric 2% inflation. Inflation below 2% means we need higher than 2% inflation.
Right.
It's just like, Jeff, you mentioned this earlier on, you said this a while ago, but you said inflation can be disastrous for an economy. Like you don't know what your value, like if inflation runs too hot, you don't know what your currency is worth in the short term
Mhm.
potentially, which is you can't transact at that point. Money loses its function. So it's like, why is the Federal Reserve? I'll never understand that. Why do they come out and say? Well, I do understand, which we can talk about
Yeah.
later, like what that,
I mean, they have
why they say it.
incentives to do it. Yeah.
Right. It's partly derived from the fact that they want to monetize the government debt. That they say inflation, we should allow for inflation because they kind of know that it's coming.
Mhm.
But they're just selling us this like, oh, like they're selling us this completely irrational, completely unstable thing. Like, this is what we need. Trust me, this is what we need. Listen to me. This will make it all work out, all worthwhile.
Listen,
Really,
child, I'll make it all better. We're just like,
it's like,
okay,
no.
Dad.
Yeah.
No, but it's like
That
the crazy thing is, none of this stuff is derived from anywhere. Like, there's no laws of
Math,
nature or math or nothing. Like, there's not even
Yeah.
like good statistical data or anything like that for this.
right.
And yet, this is the basis of everything that they're doing. And they just like, yeah, 2% inflation. And if it's lower than 2%, that's got to be even higher. But I think all they're really doing is they know higher inflation isn't coming, and they just want people not to panic. Because they not only say we need higher inflation, they want people to expect higher inflation. They need both, right?
Mm-hmm.
They want people to expect higher inflation, because if they don't expect it, what are they going to do? They're going to start selling their treasuries, because they're going to be like, whoa, where's all this inflation coming from? Like, all these treasuries I have they're not going to yield nearly enough to cover this inflation. And then that would be literally catastrophic. If there was like a panic sell in the U.S. bond market, that would be absolutely catastrophic for the U.S. government. So they're just in such a precarious position. And I think maybe they do realize how precarious it is, and I think they see the path out as potentially just a slow burn, like just slowly inflate away all the debt and crap we've accumulated, and just get people on board for that, and then we'll slowly burn our way out. That's kind of how they I think see the escape route is. But the reality is they're just enabling the government to even get further into debt. And so it's like, they're just moving the bar for them. They're not, the incentives don't change. If you make it easier for them to borrow, they're just going to keep borrowing.
It's almost like they are right in the sense that they've done way more than I expected would be possible.
Mm-hmm.
Like printing $4 trillion,
Mm-hmm.
To me, a rational investor, like a foreign investor, would say, hold up, I don't want any part of this.
Right.
But just the fact that the dollar is kind of the world standard, the global currency, global standard, meant people just bought up dollars anyway. Like, it didn't really affect it. So they could have been right, I think, to get this far into it. But I think they would have been right to create an exit strategy that's actually sustainable. So if they reeled in government spending while printing this much money, and they probably could have created a soft exit, but I don't think it's going to go forever. Like, I don't think there's any way that. I think they're operating on an assumption that, quantitative easing, for 6 years, $4 trillion, it worked. We can probably do another $4 trillion. Maybe they're thinking,
right?
Maybe we'll do $12 trillion. But I personally, I don't think that's good. Like, as soon as I saw the $4 trillion, as I was researching and learning about history, I was like, that doesn't make any sense, right? Okay, it worked out. Well, the best thing to do is never try that again. Like, you got away with one, right? You actually got away with
it's
three,
like you
right?
robbed a bank, and you're like, well, I got away with it, so I should do it again, right? It's like, no, you're just maybe you will get away with it again, but if you just keep doing it, you're gonna get caught eventually.
Yeah.
Like, there's some probability it's not gonna work eventually.
Every time.
And then once, if in the bank robbery analogy, like it's as soon as you get caught, it's over. It's it. You're done forever. So it's just like, we shouldn't be trying this so blazingly.
Yeah.
Like it's like, because as soon as it blows up in our face, we're screwed. So
yeah,
it's just like
right. We should at least treat it like we robbed a bank and got it away with it.
Right.
Like, we should be saying like, wow, we are lucky. Like, how do we reel ourselves back in? How do we create a sustainable economy?
Right.
Right. That was crazy what we had to do after 2008. Like, let's make sure that never happens again. But instead, we're like, oh, we had the greatest economy ever.
Yeah.
Stock market. Just look at the stock market and be happy.
Yeah.
And it's just like, no. Like, look at unemployment. Unemployment's low. Oh, be happy with that. Like, oh, there was never a problem. It's like, no. You don't understand. Do you want to talk about Exxon more?
I think we talked enough for this episode.
Okay. Maybe we'll do that next episode.
Yeah.
Yeah. We were at 50 minutes, yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
All right. Thanks for listening to us. Thanks for doing less. Hopefully the Federal Reserve can start doing less. They're doing a whole lot right now. They're doing 400 billion units of a lot.
Come on, that is certified, quantified by Jeff. You heard it here.
We'll see what's in store for us. Maybe this will be the last dollars they ever need to print, and then everything will be fine. But that remains to be seen.
Yeah, we'll come out and we'll say we're wrong. What we saw as a crisis, as a potential crisis, was actually nothing. But
yeah, we'll be the first to admit, yep, everything was actually fine. That was it.
Yeah.
That was the last 400 we ever needed. Then we were in the clear, and everything's smooth sailing from there. Like, hopefully that's what happens. I don't want the world to implode, but who knows?
Yeah, certainly. All right. See you next time.
See you next time.